All right, so today I'm going to take you through a walkthrough of how I would go about designing a website in Photoshop or any other image editing tool. A few of you have requested this in emails to me, so I thought I would take you through kind of my process. I'm probably not going to be talking a lot through this, and so feel free to kind of fast forward through parts that you want to and slow it down through parts that interest you a little bit more. So this is a mock-up I did using Balsamiq, just a really quick mock-up of how I want the blog to look, or my personal site to look. And you guys are going to be doing this with your personal sites, or excuse me, your final project that you're working on. You're going to be doing a Photoshop mock-up similar to this. So this is kind of a free-form exercise. There's not really a right or wrong way to do it. I'm just going to kind of take you through mine and my process and call out some things here and there within Photoshop that I find to be handy, and we'll go from there. So first of all, we need to get Photoshop opened up, and I typically do a 1024 by 768 palette, especially on this monitor, and I always start it transparent and then add a second white layer as just kind of a base background to get started. But then I always like to be able to turn it on and off. So I use layers pretty liberally. I like to be able to go back and change things. I almost use too many layers, and my layer palette tends to get a little messy. But you can use whatever works for you and whatever image editing tool you're currently using. So if we jump back to our mock-up, there's just a couple of main content areas that I want to block off first. So basically I have a header up here, kind of a title area with a search bar, and then the main content, title, paragraphs within the content, and then this is the post date, and then the tags from the actual post itself. So let's start with getting these parts mocked up. So a lot of times I will just block off the elements in various shades of grays or colors just to get the general layout. And you'll notice that I'm being pretty specific on the height of everything. There's not really there's not a formula to it, but I like to keep it into even numbers. So like a 50 pixel top header and 150 pixel title area, that'll give us 200 total pixels. And at least it's a nice clean round number, easy to remember, and that will come in handy when we're setting heights and widths in our HTML and CSS later on. So also feel free to use guides. I find them to be pretty helpful in keeping things organized and laid out. A lot of times too, I'll build a grid out of guides just to help me if I'm doing some kind of grid-based design. For this one, since I'm going to do more of a fluid design, I'm not going to worry too much about working within that grid. So the other thing I like to do is to block off text at this point, and I use lorem ipsum probably more than I should, but it at least helps me get the general layout in place. I try to also stick to web safe fonts so that I don't kind of over design the site in Photoshop and then have to revert back to standard fonts when I get it to HTML. All right, so let's go grab some dummy text. not sure how much I'll need. That'll work. So using the text tool here in Photoshop, I can adjust, if I can get it to work there, I can adjust my text area. And I'm looking for about 2/3 of the page here. It doesn't have to be perfect right now, but that's about the width I'm going for. And then we also want to make sure we add our title. And again, let's stick to web-safe fonts here so we're not over-promising in our Photoshop comp. There you go. And Photoshop will snap alignment here. So sometimes I'll also bring a guide over just to make sure that all lines up. But usually if you have snap on, which is in the view, snap, and then snap to, your elements should kind of lock up nicely just in the interface. Okay, let's add one more bit of text. Oops. If you hold down the Shift key and drag, the element will stay locked. So sometimes I'll just duplicate a text element and Shift drag it above it so I can keep the alignment. And we'll go slightly bigger on this. All right, just to wrap up the last of the text, and I'm going to omit the navigation for now, and also the search bar. We'll come back to that, but let's get the date and the tags in as well. So I think I'll duplicate this Hello World layer, and then again I'll Shift drag and pull it over to the sidebar here. And again, I'm just going to eyeball it, but we want to be pretty consistent on our margins. And then just so we can see how that will look, we can bring a guide over. And we can actually give this a little more room. There we go. So this is going to be a date. And let's go like all caps. Again, I like to duplicate layers and Shift drag. And here we can set our tags. And we'll just give those a slightly lighter color. Actually, like, to be a little bit lighter. That's better. So this is coming along pretty well. It's still a little boring, and really this isn't anything we couldn't just do in HTML. So we need to add some color, we need to add some additional design to this. So I actually think I might want to leave this section gray, but I'm going to make it a slightly lighter gray. So I'm going to do a color overlay and do, whoops, and just overlay that lighter color. And then this top bar, I think we're going to do maybe like a nice blue, something like that. So again here we can do a color overlay and drop that color in up there. Another thing I like to do is to use slightly off black colors on my typography. So a lot of times I'll take them a notch or two down just to make them blend a little bit better and not feel so harsh. All right, so now I want to add my logo up here in the corner. So I'm going to get the type tool out, and I'm going to draw an uppercase S, and then I'm going to find a font. I have a script font that I often use. And just below that, we're going to do a slightly darker blue. Actually, let's change that. That doesn't look quite as good as I was hoping it would. There, that looks a lot better. Now, one thing we will be able to do is change this text up here using Typekit or some other web font. So I'm going to go ahead and use a slightly different font up here just to help set things off a little bit. Actually, let's change that back to Helvetica. Now, I want to leave this section flat, but what you could do, which would add a nice effect to this background area, is to add a slight gradient. And what I did here is just set my two palettes to just two slightly different grays, a darker and a lighter gray. And then when I come into this layer, I can do a gradient overlay. Let's get rid of our color. We can do a gradient overlay, and then I can set that gradient to my offset colors here. And you can see when I reverse it that you can actually see the gradient. So we could do a gradient like that, which would give a slightly darker color down at the bottom. And if we wanted to, because text replacement is always an option for titling, we can even add some shadowing to this text. Let's try an inner shadow. So that's a really subtle effect, but it kind of insets the text a little bit. You could even add some more effects to that by doing a slight outer glow. If you just tone it down a little bit, it's very subtle, but it helps it kind of jump off from the background a little bit. So the last thing I want to do, or actually not the last thing, but the next thing I want to do is to quickly simulate the search box. And I like to use the rounded rectangle tool and set the radius to about 30 pixels. And then we can go ahead and draw a search box. Again, try to lock it to a standard, a fairly normal width and height. So I think here I'm going to go 240 by 40, and that should give us a nice shape. And again, we want to make sure this snaps in nicely and aligns with the center line of our title. And then we also want to make sure we push this all the way over to our far right edge. And there we go. And just like other layers, we can come in here and add some effects. So it should be nice to have a stroke. So just a border, like 1 pixel around the inside. We can take that opacity down. Like that. And we can also do a slight inner shadow. Nothing too over the top. And for right now, just add some text. All right, that'll do pretty good. All right, now let's quickly take care of our navigation up here. Let's see how that looks with that spacing. Can make one set bold. I think I'm going to bring these in just a little bit. All right, so one last thing I think I want to do is bring in just a little bit of just a few icons to make this stand out just a little bit more. First though, I'm going to save, just to make sure I don't lose anything. And then find my icons. So this blocky vector set, these are some of my favorites, and there's lots of sources and places on the web that you can get free icons. I'll list some of those below and some of the other resources to help you get through doing some comps yourself in Photoshop. So first I think I want to find a tag icon. I'll show you how I'm going to use that. That'll work. And I only need the 16 pixel one, so let's find the 16 pixel one. Alright, so there's my little tag. I'll put it there and then find my tag text, move it over. And we can do a color overlay on this to match it. And we can just use the eyedropper to make sure we have that color right. There we go. And duplicate that a few times. And that looks pretty good. And let's get a larger search icon. Actually, I'm going to open search and RSS because we're going to use both of those here. Let's start with search. And all I'm doing is bringing these into Photoshop and copying them, and then inserting them as new layers on our current document. So we could do a few different things here. One thing I might try is pulling this down behind the search box and giving it some opacity. And then duplicating that, bringing it up in front, making it smaller, and placing it inside. So kind of using a little bit of repetition there, and I think that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and leave that. And then let's get our RSS button out, copy that, and again, bring that in as a new layer. And I think it might be fitting to stick this up here. Again, using free transform in Photoshop, we can scale that down and we can slide it over. And then come in with a white color overlay. And maybe even a slight inner shadow. Nope, don't like that. Now, one last thing that would really make this kind of pop a little bit would be to add a small 1 pixel border here. Whoops. New layer. And let's give that some opacity. There you go. And then on this background, we want to have our bottom color as white, and then a really light gradient up top. So like F3, F3, F3. That's like just a slight gray. And then if we get our gradient tool out, make sure we're doing a linear gradient and pull down. Oops. Did that wrong. Let's actually reverse that. That's a little too hard to see. Let's go a little darker. There we go. So that was my problem. So if we put in a marquee here, I can then restrict where the gradient goes. So that's why that wasn't working out right. Sorry about that. So now, there, that's what I'm looking for. Now if I move that gradient down, I can see just that little bit of white at the top there. That's going to add a nice offset, and then I'm actually going to lighten up that gradient just a little bit. And you can see that that adds a little bit of depth and contrast there at the top of the site, and I think that looks pretty good. So I think this is a good place to stop in Photoshop. I never like to take it too far here because there are things you can do in Photoshop that are really difficult to implement in HTML and CSS. So I want to keep realistic elements in my design, and everything I see here will easily be reproducible in HTML and CSS using techniques that we've already learned in this class. So that's a quick walkthrough of how I put a site together in Photoshop. These techniques can be used in just about any image editing program like GIMP or any of the other new OS X or Windows image editing programs. Down below, I've provided some additional links to help you if you don't have Photoshop. So give those a look and use this to help guide you as you're working on your final projects over the next month.